US President Donald Trump is threatening to impose 50% tariffs on European Union imports starting on June the 1st. The EU says it stands ready to defend its interests. But is Trump genuinely seeking a deal with the EU? And is Europe about to pay a high price for not settling with Trump sooner? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. US President Donald Trump is threatening to slap a 50% tariff on all goods from the EU after complaining trade negotiations are going nowhere. Last month, he announced a 20% tariff on most EU goods, but brought that back down to 10%. These new threats run the risk of damaging an important trade relationship which had been showing signs of recovery. And if Trump goes through with his tariffs, the EU will have higher import taxes on its hundreds of billions of dollars worth of exported goods. The 27-member bloc says it maintains the same line, de-escalation, but is ready to respond. So will the EU retaliate, or will Trump's tariffs, now his signature move, backfire for American manufacturing? We'll put those questions to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Hamza Mohammed.
We have a very big announcement today.
President Donald Trump is once again taking aim at America's trading partners. This time, it's the European Union. Just hours before planned trade talks, Trump threatened to impose new tariffs on all European goods.
I'm not looking for a deal. I mean, we've set the deal, it's at 50%. But again, there is no tariff if they build their plant here. Now, if somebody comes in and wants to build a plant here, I can talk to them about a little bit of a delay. But, while they're building their plant, which is something I think that would be appropriate, maybe.
The EU is one of the United States' largest trading partners, exporting more than $600 billion in goods to the US last year, while importing roughly $370 billion. Trump blames that trade deficit on what he calls unfair European policies, particularly on cars and agricultural products. The EU says it wants to reach a trade deal with Washington, but any agreement must be based on mutual respect and not threats.
I believe such tariffs will help no one, but would only lead to economic development in both markets suffering as a result. And that's why we continue to focus on negotiations and supporting the European Commission in defending Europe and the European markets while simultaneously exerting persuasive power on America.
Last month, Trump imposed a 20% tariff on certain European goods during his so-called Liberation Day announcement, but later cut that figure in half, giving negotiators until July to strike a deal. Analysts say Trump's threat is a negotiating tactic.
I think the European Union cannot cave in and should not try to appease Donald Trump at this point. The experience of the last couple of months is that this US president actually blinks. I mean, he actually gives in when faced with the major negative consequences of his actions.
And as negotiators from both sides hold talks, the stakes and the rhetoric couldn't be higher. Hamza Mohammed, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. In Washington, D.C. is Paolo van Schirach, President of the Global Policy Institute. In London, Will Hutton joins us. He's political economist and President of the Academy of Social Sciences. And in Hong Kong, Brian Wong, a fellow at the Centre of Contemporary China and the World. He's also assistant professor at Hong Kong University. Thanks so much for joining us here on Inside Story today for this fascinating discussion. Paolo, if I can begin with you first off, and if we can start with Donald Trump and his latest move. Is this a negotiating tactic? Is it a credible threat? Is he having a tantrum? Is there genuine concern that the EU is actually dragging its feet?
Well, it's really hard to say. We've seen how this process of declaring major tariffs and then suspending them and then creating a kind of a lull for further negotiations we've seen a little bit of everything regarding practically, I would dare say, the entire world. We're talking about tariffs on Canada, tariffs on Mexico, tariffs on China, tariffs on the European Union, tariffs on India, etc., etc., etc. So is this, as your reporting pointed out, potentially a negotiating ploy to put pressure on the Europeans, or is this for real? I mean, are we done? He basically said, we're done negotiating. The Europeans are not serious. They don't come back with credible proposals, and therefore this is it. Now, if this is it, this is the closest thing to a trade embargo. I don't want to exaggerate this, but it is pretty close because 50%, it basically puts at least certain European products out of the market, because consumers certainly will be reluctant, depending on what it is, because obviously this affects everything, to digest the price hike. There is some merit, I should say, in this rather confused environment. The European Union has great difficulty negotiating as a bloc. There are 27 countries. The European negotiators, talking on behalf of everybody, have to, reconcile different positions from strong states economically and weak ones. Big, small. There's Germany, but there is also, Malta. It's not all the same.
It's hard to get everyone on the same page, obviously. Well, I want to see how you assess all of this. I mean, you wrote last month that Trump was badly wounded and that this was the moment that Europe could seize the advantage. But with this move from Donald Trump, is that advantage now gone?
No, I think that. I think it's. I think the idea that that the Europeans confront a 50% tariff and China only a 30% tariff is very extraordinary, and I think that it's likely that Trump will back off. I mean, I agree with the previous speaker with that. It's not just that getting an alignment between 27 countries is tricky for the European Union. It's that the reach of what the Americans want is to really, what's an issue here is whose regulatory standards are going to become the global standard. And the United States knows that for some time now, in a whole bunch of industries, including agriculture and automobiles, it is the EU that has set the global standard, and they want that to stop. And for that to stop, the EU has to literally put up its hand and surrender, which it can't do, particularly because the standards it is setting are kind of the ones it wants for its own 440 million consumers, cars, food, you name it. So, this is really problematic. And I don't see what the European Union can do except to offer some more inward investment to the Americans, building some factories. It can buy yet more fertilizers and fossil fuels, but it can't give too much ground. And it can also make things pretty uncomfortable for some American states. It's got quite a sophisticated list of areas and products which it will target, rather like China did so successfully. And I think that the Europeans are going to take kind of a leaf out of the kind of China's playbook here and fight fire with fire. And it could be that famous acronym that's doing the rounds now, TACO, Trump always chickens out, kind of will apply here. And that providing that the Europeans can provide some kind of fig leaf, Trump will climb down. But if he doesn't, I think you're looking at something very profound, a kind of something close to a trade embargo, and certainly a kind of very, very kind of the acutest rift in transatlantic relations since 1945.
Yeah, Brian, I want to get your assessment of all of this. We saw Trump threaten China with these exorbitant tariffs, 145%. China hit back with its own reciprocal tariffs. Then Trump took a step back. The two are now negotiating. So, can the EU risk, pushing forward, coming out on the offensive here and hoping that Trump blinks yet again, that he caves in yet again, do you think?
I most certainly agree with both Paolo and Will that fundamentally Donald Trump respects, or maybe respect is the wrong word, but he reacts to displays of strength and resolute determination. And that is to say that when Beijing threatened through weaponizing its export of rare earths, through imposing retaliatory tariffs, but also all sorts of non-tariff related restrictions in trade, ultimately Washington felt the heat. It felt the pressure, especially in the form of the very powerful sort of lobbying groups that Trump had been implicitly responding to, especially those who were dependent upon Chinese exports, whether it be for further processing and manufacturing or for their very own consumption goods and distribution via franchises. So I would say that the pressures from the sort of business lobby certainly contributed towards the capitulation, but also if you look at the rather erratic and stark movements in the US Treasury bond markets, with yields climbing to rare heights unreached ever since, of course, that 5% that was reached during Biden's term. It's a sign that Trump is taking indeed rather seriously these market signals. And the market signals are saying one thing, which is that they are deeply concerned about not just the impact on inflation, but also economic growth within America arising from these retaliatory measures. So in short, in order to defend its strategic autonomy, I think it behoves the European Union to stand up for its member states and to say, look, at the end of the day, this transatlantic relationship is only special, is only going to add value for both sides if there's a modicum of respect. And there's a dearth of respect, whether it be as conveyed by Vance's speech in Munich or Trump's actions over the past couple of months. And ultimately, the European Union deserve to have a say and a place at the table. So in my view, it is in the EU's interest to both extend an olive branch, but also to demonstrate strength and resolve and to really put its foot, where its mouth is, right, when it comes to imposing reasonable costs and retaliatory measures in face of such overtly bellicose rhetoric and also threats from Washington.
Paolo, Brian touched on it a little bit there, but in the US, many experts fear there's going to be this dreaded combination of higher inflation and slower growth, with some even saying that economic growth could drop 1.5%. I mean, Trump, in the lead up to the election, basically promised America's next golden age. Does that put all of this at risk if the tariffs go through?
Well, yes, of course. Again, it's really hard to understand what the calculus of the administration is because, as we have been observing, these things change. I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but they do change a lot from certain perspectives, whereby if you operate in this marketplace as a company, as a financial institution, as an investor, you really have no idea what's going to happen. And also, regarding Mr. Trump's declared objective of the tariffs, what is the biggest goal of America? To say to countries, instead of selling things to us so that we have a trade deficit with you, you come here. You're welcome. Set up your factories in America, and there is no problem. You operate in the American market, hire American workers, and sell in the American market. What's wrong with that? And everybody benefits. America grows. There's more employment and no tariffs on goods that are made in the United States. The problem with this reasoning, which on the surface doesn't sound crazy, is that this is extremely difficult to do. Over the long run, it's possible. Let me give, if I may, just a quick example,
yes, please,
which goes back to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, when the problem of the trade deficit with the United States was Japan, and particularly the auto sector. They forced the Japanese to put quotas on imported cars to the United States. Well, what did the big Japanese companies do? They set up assembly plants in the United States. Toyota, if I'm not mistaken, has the biggest manufacturing plant in Kentucky. Okay, in the United States. You say, what? Yes, that's exactly what happened. And that's a legacy of the protectionism and the trade and the tariffs policies of the Reagan administration. We go back to the 1980s here. So Trump's logic is not conceptually flawed. The problem is that it is extremely difficult to do all this, and particularly to do it quickly. You don't set up
right
in this globalized economy new factories and the complex web of supply chains overnight. And by the way, the United States doesn't have the absorption capacity to say, okay, let's set up 20 different type of manufacturing plants throughout the country. It's not possible. The workers are not there. The specialized engineers of some particularly sophisticated sector, they just don't exist. And you cannot make them up, overnight.
Okay, we'll move on because we're going to get to Apple and the tariffs that he's threatening against Apple in just a moment, which comes to the manufacturing point you're trying to make there, Paolo. Will, if I can just talk about the consequences here potentially for the EU. I mean, there's talk that if these tariffs go through, it could push them into recession. I mean, Trump has quite an open disdain and scorn for the European Union. Why is that? And do you think that they've actually got the backbone to respond with strength to Donald Trump's move?
Great questions. I mean, when I hear Donald Trump talking about the European Union, I mean, I'm stunned by his history or his interpretation of history. The European Union was never, I mean, in his mind, it was set up kind of in opposition to the United States, to rip the United States off. I mean, the founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, Konrad Adenauer, and the other great men of the time. I mean, it was a peace project, absolutely, first and foremost, a peace project to bring, first of all, the Europe of the Six and ultimately growing to encompass the whole of Europe together to kind of settle what had been kind of centuries of kind of internecine conflict. I mean, the idea that it was in any sense to kind of do down American manufacturing is so kind of crazed. I mean, your mouth drops open. And then, value-added tax, which he thinks is a particular tax devised by these noxious Europeans to do down America. And it's a sophisticated purchase tax. I mean, it's a way of kind of ensuring that every part of the value chain pays its proportionate tax towards the final product. It's not directed against American manufacturers. And so, the Europeans confront this kind of, I mean, almost kind of beyond belief set of views about Europe. It is true that Europe should have been spending more on defense than it has been, and that has needled successive generations of kind of American presidents. But again, I mean, the Americans get kind of a tremendous advantage from kind of their security kind of apparatus. And it gives kind of leverage. It underpins kind of their soft power with hard power. So, I mean, I find the whole kind of discourse very, very strange and kind of course, as I said earlier, the United States, kind of the great American companies account for 2/3 of the merchandise trade deficit. So, what do you do about that if you're Europe? What do you do about this kind of nexus of issues? And I agree with Brian. Ultimately, all the Europeans can do is to kind of talk about mutual respect, offer some olive branches where they can, and hit back hard rather as the Chinese did. But it's dangerous. It's really dangerous.
Okay.
No one can say at this point. He himself will dislike this. He'll dislike this. Trump always chickens out. He knows that's doing the rounds, and he'll want to show a bit of macho kind of. I'm not for chickening out. So this is a very dangerous moment in kind of European.
Hard to back him into a corner. We touched on this just before, but prior to threatening new tariffs on the EU, Trump also warned Apple that he wants to slap a 25% tariff on imported iPhones brought by US consumers. He then went on to expand that threat to all smartphones. Let's take a listen.
It would be more. It would be also Samsung and anybody that makes that product. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair. So anybody that makes that product, and that'll start on, I guess, the end of June. It'll come out. I think we have that appropriately done by the end of June. So if they make that product. Now, again, when they build their plant here, there's no tariff. So they're going to be building plants here. But I had an understanding with Tim that he wouldn't be doing this. He said he's going to India to build plants. I said, that's okay to go to India, but you're not going to sell into here without tariffs.
Well, the Tim he's talking about there is Tim Cook, the Apple CEO. Brian, of all the companies and really of all the products, why is he going after the iPhone, although he did expand that to include all smartphones?
Well, I don't think he is just exclusively targeting Apple or Tim Cook personally. I think it is a sign that Trump wants to target instinctively, right, what many would view to be the highest value-adding manufacturing stages and processes within supply chains of course, very much in-demand consumer electronics, right? And Apple just happens to be a particularly pronounced or visceral example. And I guess what this illustrates is a broader point that in a Trump administration, the lines between the private and the public, the entrepreneurial and the state, the citizenry and the government, these lines are increasingly blurred. It's almost ironic considering the kinds of countries that, of course, America has long positioned itself as the rival and the purported alternative to, that this is a sort of rhetoric and, psyche that's been enshrined. But more seriously and specifically, the comments that were made on Apple vis-a-vis India, and more generally speaking, about his reluctance to let American manufacturers relocate to India in other contexts, as he expressed, I think, a couple of days ago, is a sign that it's not so much about targeting China or targeting countries with gigantic trade surpluses vis-a-vis the US. It's instead about imposing, almost unilaterally and universally, a demand that corporations must indeed manufacture and invest in America. Now, of course, there will be corporate leaders and executives who pay lip service to that, who acknowledge on paper the need and case for doing so. But in practice, as Paolo and Will both highlighted just then, the barriers for their doing so are incredibly high. The overhead costs, the logistical and legal challenges, the planning permits that must be sorted out prior to any and all sorts of serious industrial activity. And above all, the two fundamental questions that remain unresolved is, A, are the American populations and the people at large willing to work in these very jobs? And B, to the extent automation is going to be the primary modus operandi of many of these newly built factories, where are these jobs going to come from? And to whom are these jobs going to go, given that, Donald Trump has also enacted this mass sort of deportation program against immigrants, including folks who may not, in fact, be illegal immigrants or folks who are indeed on student visas and could otherwise contribute towards the American economy. So these are my questions.
Yeah. Well, Paolo, you touched on this a little bit before. Obviously, Trump's dead set keen to bring manufacturing back to the United States. We've heard some of the reasons why that is nigh on impossible because of the costs, the workers. So does he just not understand the difficulty in doing this, or he does understand and doesn't care?
Well, honestly, I don't have a good answer for this. I don't know who he listens to. There are different voices, I think, within the administration. The Secretary of the Treasury says one thing, the trade negotiator maybe something a little bit different. However, let's try to, this is really such a complicated situation that is hard to understand what is the main point here. But, regarding the effort to make America, say, self-sufficient and have all the strategic sectors of the economy based in the United States. Well, you can say, oh, really? But that goes against free trade, goes against globalization. Well, let me point out that this is exactly what China has been doing now for 20 years, to make China independent of any strategic dependence of critical materials, technologies, etc., on anybody. And that's an openly declared Chinese policy, okay? They say we want to make everything on our own because we don't trust the international system, essentially, because also we may be hit by moves like tariffs or targeting exports of critical technologies. And so we're going to make everything at home. This is open, declared Chinese policy. Nobody says anything about that. It looks like, okay, well, that's what the Chinese do. So when they do it, apparently it's okay. If America wants to do it, oh my God, what are the Americans doing? So all this outrage is a bit manufactured, in my opinion. However,
Brian, hang on a sec, Paolo. Because Brian, just before you move on, Brian, I want you to jump in there because I want to get a sense. I can get a sense that you're completely disagreeing with what we're hearing there.
No, I don't completely disagree. I think it's absolutely fair to say that China, too, of course, weaponizes exports, weaponizes trade, and also employs, in many ways, restrictions on what it trades with other countries as part of its statecraft. But I guess just two quick observations. The first is that The criticism that most are making of the Trump government is that, what's being done here actively hurts the American people. In fact, the very denizens and the electorate who put him into power. As for the case of China, with its sort of mass subsidies and state-driven industrial policy, thanks to a mixture of scale, size, and also its actual manufacturing prowess, I don't think its citizens are suffering as a result of its export controls. And secondly, let's not forget that America benefits on net hugely from all that it had previously enjoyed in terms of having a net trade deficit, and that is to say a currency dominance and hegemony, ability to keep goods cheap, and the enjoyment of huge service export surplus with the rest of the world. These are benefits that China had never been privy to enjoying, but the simple fact that it's just been in a completely different part and completely different stage of the industrial and economic curve vis-a-vis America. So I don't think the double standards here, quote unquote, are a real issue.
Right. Well, we've only got a minute or so left. I want to give the final word to you. If we can take a bit of a step back and looking at both of these issues, the tariffs on Apple as well as the EU. I mean, a lot of Donald Trump supporters say that he is playing 4D chess, that his moves are so far advanced that most people just don't understand them or really appreciate just how good they are. What do you make of statements like that and what we have seen from Donald Trump over the last couple of weeks when it comes to this latest round of tariffs?
Couple of points. I do get why the Americans want manufacturing. I mean, there's J.D. Vance, Hilly Billy Blues, the book he wrote, and conversations he had with interesting Labour politicians here in Britain, makes the point that actually an economy needs some part of it, at least, to be in the business of manufacture, of making, of crafting, of having those kind of artisanal skills. And if you lose them, particularly in part, because the service sector tends to be in cities, manufacturing tends to be in towns, and agriculture, of course, in village is. And, you want that balance. So I do get what's driving this. And I also get the kind of American sense that actually these imbalances that they've experienced with the rest of the world, in particular China and the Europeans, have got to be sorted. So I do get all that. Yes. But I just want to say that I do think this debate and I think Brian and Paolo have really driven the point home, and I hope I'm doing it too. I mean, this is recklessness. It's unilateralism gone mad. It's bullying. It's self-defeating. It hurts yourself as much as others. It risks what little we have left of the international trade order. And actually, trade between countries is the precursor for growth. Yes. It's all very well. I mean, China doesn't want to go too far down this kind of autarkic road. I mean, you need to buy and sell. It is wherever there's trade, there's economic growth. And to turn our back on that internationally is an international disaster.
Right. Thank you so much. Recklessness and self-defeating. Well, let's see what happens on June the 1st. Thank you so much, Paolo, Will and Brian. We really do appreciate your time and your insight here on Inside Story. Well, thanks to all our guests, Paolo, Will and Brian. Thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the entire team here, goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.